Welcome back to our YouTube channel. Today, Alexa Weber, our sommelier, and I are going to be talking Italian wines. My name is Christine Pollack. I'm the marketing director for River Wine Cellars, and we have gotten several questions from folks about comparing Italian wines with Oregon wines and just kind of some general information. Because they know we can tap into Alexa's extensive education in the wine industry. So Alexa, just to kick things off for this session, why don't you describe some of your background? We know you're a certified sommelier and you have other education in the Italian wines. So why don't you give us an overview of your background?
Sure. Just to kind of sum up now almost 15-year wine career, I kind of fell in love with wine working for a small retail shop in Eastern Oregon in between college. At some point I fell in love with French wine, and that led me on a trajectory to not only explore the wines of France, but also at some point move there for a year during school to study, drink French wine, eat French food. I was also a skier, so I lived in the Alps, and that was a good opportunity to ski some of the great resorts. But in that time, after my time in France, I moved to Vermont, where that was my first wine job, and I was a sort of like a wine steward for a man who was at that point an advanced sommelier. So he sort of started to mentor me a little bit, and I was interested. Moved back to Utah and did my intro somm class. About 7 years later, when I received my job as the sommelier at a luxury hotel, then that was when I furthered my testing, mostly because it's not inexpensive to do a lot of these classes. If you're an enthusiast, it's definitely something to consider. But in that time, the company I was working for paid for my French and Italian wine scholar program from the Wine Scholar Guild as well. So both really reputable bodies for studying wine. And at this point, I'm hoping to do some wine and spirits education trust classes as well. So we'll just see where it takes me. Now that my kids are a little older, I might have a tiny bit of time to do something for myself.
Yeah, that's awesome. What a career. So getting into Italian wines more, there are numerous varietals, and it's kind of overwhelming for the American consumer. Can you give us a general overview of some characteristics of the popular varietals and wine growing regions in Italy?
Oh, well, that depends on who you ask. But yes, Italy is kind of a daunting wine country, and not only because region to region it can be very specific, right, culinary wise and wine wise, but there are rumors that there are over 2,000 grape varieties just in Italy alone, right? Wow. So a lot of these haven't necessarily been documented, but there are vineyards that are growing on the hillsides in small towns that may be some obscure varietal that's been grown there for thousands of years, right, since Etruscan times. So it's a really unique and diverse region. I think what people are probably most familiar with, what they know, right, Chianti, obviously, which for those of you that don't know is the Sangiovese grape. Pinot Grigio, Italy is the home. And although it's grown all over the country, the best examples are from the Northeast, around Veneto and the Friuli region. And then the Super Tuscan movement, right? And that was something that happened in the 80s, where the Italians were like, hey, we need to break the rules. The Italian Ministry of Agriculture, just like the Ministry of Agriculture in France, is very strict about how they can label what goes into it, which is kind of similar to Oregon, right? We have some of the strictest wine laws in the country here. So it's really just to preserve purity of place, and that's very important for the Italians.
Yeah. So speaking of some of those well-known, Chianti, Super Tuscan. So if I'm standing in front of my wine store aisle or grocery store aisle, and I have a ton of Italian wines in front of me, how do you go about pairing them with food? We always think of Italy is pasta, which is Chianti, but can you give us some suggestions of pairings?
Sure. Well, one thing to consider about pairing Italian wine with food is the Italians are great at it, right? I mean, they make wine to go with food. Food is their initial component. Wine comes secondary. So the wines of Italy are often high acid, low alcohol, meant to be consumed with lots of different foods. And if you're really interested, then you start thinking about the cuisine of a particular region, because each part of Italy has very specific typical cuisine, and they make the wines to go with the food there. So a good example would be Nebbiolo, which is a grape that's grown in the Piedmont, which makes the wines Barolo and Barbaresco. You can also find it in labeled varietally Nebbiolo, but they also grow a lot of truffles there. So, and mushrooms. So you think about risottos or pastas with truffles, or even if you had a steak with some shaved truffle on it. And Oregon is also famous for truffles, right? So there are a lot of kind of corresponding things between Oregon and the Piedmont. Maybe the thing about Nebbiolo is it's very tannic. So it's like a Pinot on
steroids.
Like a
Pinot on steroids.
This has tons and tons and tons of tannin, so often they age really well for a long time. But there's a lot of similarities for pairings there as well. I think another one to think about is oftentimes people overlook the south of Italy, places like Campania, Sicily, which makes some really beautiful wines. But really, you're kind of safe exploring if you're willing to step out of the box a little bit and look at the labels. Italians sometimes are good at labeling with what the grape is. Sometimes they're not. So again, it's kind of a crapshoot. That's why we have our handy cell phones to tell us a little bit about it. But for the most part, I think you're safe. Red wines are generally high in acid. Super Tuscans, clearly they're bigger, bolder red wines. And then there can be wines like Amarone, which is a huge, big, bold, dark fruit red wine. So it's really about exploring Italy. It's too hard to sum up in 2 minutes. It's like, don't go to the store and go for Chianti. Like, try an Aglianico. Maybe try something from Sicily that you've never seen before. Primitivo is related to the Zinfandel grape, so there's a lot of comparisons, but it goes on and on.
Yeah, it's fun to compare, and certainly in this time of quarantine and social distancing, as everybody is becoming their own chefs and taking more time in the kitchen, you know, it's fun to pair the wine. So just to bring it back to the Oregon wine growing regions, and I know you've already mentioned some, but you know, I'm a big fan of our medium body estate Pinot Noir, and then also crisp Pinot Gris. Which I think most people are wondering, okay, what's the difference between Pinot Gris, Pinot Grigio? But if you can talk a little about comparing those two varietals that we produce with something that would be an equivalent in Italy.
Sure. I spoke a little bit about Nebbiolo and Pinot, other than the tannins, but I think a lot of the red wines, especially from the Piedmont, there's Barbera, Dolcetto. Some of those can kind of fit that category of medium-bodied, high acid, right? Which Pinot often has a lot of high acid too. I think another place to look if you're into that style, and they're some of my favorite regions too, because I also really enjoy that style. If you go south to Sicily, if you see a wine labeled Etna DOC, that means it comes from the slopes of Mount Etna. And those are generally, they're called the Barolo of the South, right? So it's kind of that medium-bodied, structured tannic, really aromatic and floral. They can be made in lots of different styles, but they're really nice. And that's Nerello Mascalese and Nerello Cappuccio are generally the grapes. Montepulciano d'Abruzzo, one of my favorite all-time red wines. It's inexpensive, it's good, it pairs with lots of food. That actually comes from the east side of Italy. And it's kind of a more fruit forward. And there's lots of styles emerging now, right? Because we're so into tasting new wines and trying new things that there's lots of Italian wines that were unheard of, you know, 5 or 10 years ago that are now coming on the scene. As far as white wines and Pinot Grigio, I would highly recommend seeking out some white wines from Campania. They are beautifully floral, crisp, delicate. Campania is also the home of Naples, right? Napoli, which is the birthplace of pizza. So think about their red wines, which is sometimes Aglianico based, are great with pizza, but the whites are floral and delicate. I'm speaking to Falanghina, Fiano di Avellino, and Greco di Tufo, which are some of my all-time favorite white wines. So that's a thought.
So I was supposed to go to Italy in May and obviously need to reschedule the trip, but I will live vicariously through these suggestions you just gave.
Well, that's what we do though, right? That's why wine is so fun, because it's like, well, I can't be there, but I can drink a wine from there and pretend.
Yeah, and pretend. I mean, you can't go wrong with drinking Prosecco and eating gelato every day either.
Right.
That Italian feel.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and you just reviewed on another video our Cuvée Blanc, which kind of has that same relaxing, sit outside feel as you get from Prosecco to just a great drinking summer, late spring wine.
Right.
Yeah. So before I let Alexa go, just want to remind all of you to continue to send us questions, and we'll do more of these Q&A sessions. Send us your questions at info@puddingriver.com. And we have just revamped our online store. It's up and running. We're going to be expanding the list of states that we can ship to, but certainly check it out. And hope to do another session soon with Alexa and then also our winemaker, Sean Allen. So look for a future session, the three of us, about Pinot Noir. So thanks, Alexa.
Thanks, Chris.
Take care.